MovieWeb.com.
So to begin with, I wanted to ask you about a little bit how you got involved with Freakonomics, with the project.
Yeah, I met the producer I met the producer Chad Troutwine, and he had already secured the rights to the book, and he talked to me about potentially doing a section and coming on as a producer, and so I sort of joined forces at that point, helped pick out the different directors.
Okay, they weren't involved. You were the first. You were on before most of
He'd
them.
actually already spoken to Morgan,
right,
but no work had begun, so it was really early on, and we helped think through who some of the other directors might be.
Oh, great. Did you give some suggestions? I mean, obviously, these guys are all your colleagues and your peers.
Yeah, I mean, I as it turned out, I think that the folks that we chose ended up representing kind of the class of 2010 in the sense that they all have a different voice that represents the range of the work that's being done right now. There's a lot of other great filmmakers that weren't part of the group.
Right.
But, we're doing Super Freakonomics, so there should be an opportunity to work with some other folks too.
Yeah, awesome. Correct me if I'm wrong, you actually directed the sort of introductory sections, the in-between sections, right?
Yeah, I did the interstitials, partly selfishly because I love the book, and so I wanted to be able to do a bunch of little pieces. So when I came on as a producer, there was a conversation, when I direct the segment, should it be a segment like everybody else, or maybe I could do pieces that could help glue the film together and give it sort of a cohesive tone. And that ended up being the approach.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I really like that too. So that was sort of the idea, to go in and do a way that you could kind of bridge all the other pieces together.
Yeah, and dovetail, because each of the sections has its own style in a way, because each of the directors have their own way of working. So Morgan Spurlock's is very Morgan, right? And Heidi and Rachel's is totally verite. And so since we were going to be putting these right next to each other, the notion was how are we gonna transition between them, and also give the film a feeling of like headquarters or home base, and also give a sort of voice to the authors, because some of the sections really have the voice of the documentarian more than the book, which is great and fine, but also I think the authors of the book should have a voice in a film that's about the book, or inspired by adapting that book. So that was my approach.
Yeah, and then how did you sort of keep your signature style, as a director, we're sort of used to from King of Kong, to, because that's definitely in those pieces, and everyone's sort of signature style, Morgan's and everyone's, kind of comes through. So how were you able to sort of keep that in this material?
I'm a total animation nerd, so one of the things I wanted to do in our sections was to do them in an animation style as much as possible, and you saw the sort of whimsy of the M&M's piece with Levitt's daughter when she was being potty trained, right? There's that, and like the real estate section, we created a little train town, out of these parts that we bought in a little kit, so we could animate that town for the real estate section. So there's, that I'd say that's really how we approached it and gave it that sense of, and we had like the same editors and team as from Kong, so.
Oh, cool.
That inevitably lends it the same kind of tone.
Yeah. And you had mentioned being a big fan of the books, so you specifically were really working with the Stevens in your scenes. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about working with them? And
it was sort of an 11th hour rush on my sections, because we committed to being in Tribeca and premiering there before we'd even had a chance to see the film fully assembled, right? I hadn't seen all the pieces. So I had 6 weeks to get the our whole sections done, soup to nuts, and partly out of that, there's nothing like restrictions to force creativity, right? So we went and interviewed the Stevens, and we assembled that interview, and then based our sections on what we learned from them, and I felt like that was the right way to do our pieces, and it worked well.
And that sort of guided how the structure of the film, how it kind of came together?
Yeah, because I knew, I hadn't seen, for example, Eugene Jarecki's section, but I knew it was Roe versus Wade, right?
Right.
And that's ultimately a chapter about causality and causation and what leads to what. So I knew if I did a chapter break that dealt with that issue, which ended up being the piece about polio and whether polio was caused by ice cream, which was a misunderstanding in the 40s and 50s in our country. I knew that if I did that chapter break, that would inevitably connect. So that's kind of the approach.
Yeah, and what were some of the issues from the book that you really wanted to make sure came out in the film? Because there's so much in the book that's covered.
Yeah.
How was it sort of decided, well, this is an important, theme or an important section that we need to sort of express in the film?
I knew what each of the directors were going to do for their sections, and it was good fortune that each of them chose a different topic from one another. And then I knew all the ones that weren't being covered, right? Because those are the ones that were left, and there's so many great little bits and anecdotes and stuff from the book that I just knew if I selected, 10 or 15 of those, I'd get a solid 5 or 6, done, and that's what we did.
So you covered sort of all the beats or all the important things that you thought needed to kind of come out for the film.
Well, there's
to be Freakonomics the movie.
There's principles from economics that underpin the work in the book. So I knew that if I got at causation, or I got at, behavioral economic principles, like what really motivates a real estate agent, if I got at that stuff, that it would be a great way to tee up the sections to come.
Right, and was it kind of finding things that, like you said, like the the housing thing? Obviously, that's something that any audience member that's watching this film now is going to, click to right away. So was it sort of also picking things that audiences could sort of relate to really well?
Yeah,
quickly?
I was interested in covering topics that people could connect to quickly. I think we all can relate to the notion of buying a house and the strange feeling you have that the people who are brokering that transaction have different incentives than you do. But I think the book did a marvelous job at putting a fine point on that, the difference in incentives between the agent and the person, the buyer or the seller.
Is it sort of daunting when a book like this so eloquently and clearly sort of expresses all of these kind of difficult issues to sort of wrap your head around? As a filmmaker, to then, is at a certain point are you like, well, the book did it so well? I mean, is it daunting to sort of then translate it?
I think all of the directors had an unspoken fear or concern that we wouldn't do the book justice. And I think we were all relieved when the two guys saw the film for the first time at Tribeca, that we were relieved to find that they were very happy with the treatment that the book had gotten, It's so good, it's so well written, it's so eloquent, it's so deft in all of its, turns of phrase and the way it goes from one topic to another, that I think we just all wanted to do the thing justice.
Yeah, and unlike some of the other filmmakers on the project, I mean, you really had a hands-on with the Stevens, in the scenes that you were directing. So could you tell me a little bit about working with them? I mean, how did they sort of feel about the whole project?
Well, for me, I feel like the Stevens have a very well rehearsed set of anecdotes and sound bites that they're used to going to sort of a deep well about Freakonomics, define the term, define economics. How does that relate to the economy? There's all these things that they get asked again and again and again, and they have all this stuff teed up, and I wanted them to have a chance to say the things they normally say, but I was much more interested in, the story behind the story, or, anecdotes that aren't on the beaten path for them. So that was, for me, the real challenge of that interview, was trying to get to new material for them, for all of our, enjoyment.
That's interesting. So is this sort of like digging I mean, obviously, like you said, you wanted to allow them to, make the points that they're used to making, but how do you sort of dig beneath that to get something new?
It was really a matter of keeping at it. We spent a solid day doing that. And we all, when we're first talking about stuff, go to what's comfortable and familiar, because frankly, if it's the easiest thing to do, and then it was just a matter of time to get to some stuff that was a little fresher. Like I think my favorite thing in the whole movie is when he's telling that story of how his daughter duped him,
right?
But when he tried to teach her, or tried to potty train her by giving her an M&M bribe, and that anecdote only came out of having talked about all the other things they usually do for a while, and I love it. I think that's the kind of thing we all want to hear, is the stuff that's not as rehearsed.
Total BS, wasn't it?